Good morning.
Good morning, Mr.
We'll begin our capstone defenses today with Josh Fermin. His thesis statement is this: obtaining carbon neutrality in America in the near future, especially through the push for electric vehicles, puts stress on society to change its economics, advance science, and build infrastructure at an unrealistic rate. Please welcome Josh.
On Christmas Eve of 2022, Dominic Noddy was trying to get home to his family. He owns a Tesla Model S. It is his only vehicle. He is traveling at sub-freezing temperatures, around 19 degrees Fahrenheit, and he notices his battery is low. He plugs it into a supercharger and waits for the battery to warm up so it can accept the charge, and he even tries to charge it at home. However, his battery remains dead, with only 19 miles of range shown. Even after an hour of waiting, the car still displayed a message that the battery was heating to accept the charge. Dominic was forced to cancel his holiday plans because his car couldn't drive. Electric vehicles are just one of the proposed methods of combating the United States carbon output. But how can we rely on technology that cannot reliably get us from point A to point B? Reaching carbon neutrality in America by 2050 is an unrealistic deadline for multiple reasons. It puts stress on our economy. It costs too much money all at once. There's not enough total support, and there's not enough time to make the transition. In 2020, over 80% of energy demand was supplied by fossil fuels. Reaching carbon neutrality in America by 2050 cannot be accomplished while this is our reality. The United States also needs to develop an infrastructure with the capability to support certain things required for carbon neutrality, including updated power grids, factories, charging stations for electric vehicles, and the businesses involved in the electrification of the cars and those mining the critical minerals needed need to be able to cleanly mine them. How much will building the required infrastructure cost, and who does this cost fall on? Is the American public even in support of the new policies, and what is the general response to them? Obtaining carbon neutrality in America in the near future, especially through the push for electric vehicles, puts stress on society to change its economics, advance science, and build infrastructure at an unrealistic rate. So how did this all begin? In 2021, the United States formally joined the Paris Agreement, joining 194 other parties. The agreement sets long-term goals to guide all of its member nations to do three things. 1. Substantially reduce global greenhouse gas emissions to limit the global temperature increase in this century to 2 degrees Celsius, while pursuing efforts to limit the increase even further to 1.5 degrees. 2. Review countries' commitments every 5 years. And 3. Provide financing to developing countries to mitigate climate change, strengthen resilience, and enhance abilities to adapt to climate impacts. The United States government has set a goal of making America carbon neutral by 2050. The government says this can be accomplished by integrating new technologies and cleaner energy combined with carbon offset programs. Megan Wallerton, senior writer and editor for CNET, defines carbon neutrality as when the operations of your business or national economy emit the same amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that you offset by some other means. As of now, over 100 countries have pledged carbon neutrality by 2050, none of which are taking the steps the US is, and only 8 small countries have achieved a so-called carbon neutrality. America still relies on certain industries that would need to be eliminated or changed. America's economy would also have to see a massive shift away from fossil fuels. Drew DeSilva of Pew Research Center found that in the first 10 months of 2019, the U.S. pumped nearly 3.7 billion barrels of crude oil, more than 2 billion more than in the same period in 2009, according to data from the Energy Information Administration, or the EIA. The U.S. was also the world's biggest producer of both oil and gas in 2018, ahead of Saudi Arabia and Russia, respectively. Mark Perry, professor of economics and finance at the University of Michigan, conducted a study and found that oil, coal, and natural gas provide the large majority of the nation's energy, supplying 81% of the United States energy demand in 2020. Data from the EIA shows that in 2022, emissions of carbon dioxide by the United States electric power sector were 1,539 million metric tons, or about 31% of the total U.S. energy-related CO2 emissions. In 2021, greenhouse gas emissions from transportation accounted for 28% of total U.S. greenhouse emissions. The American economy revolves around fossil fuels in the stock market as well, with 19 of the top 20 spots in the S&P 500 belonging to companies connected to fossil fuels in some way. Additionally, around 70% of Americans believe that a total switch away from fossil fuels would be damaging to the country as a whole. Citizens of the United States have to first be convinced that carbon neutrality is even possible before they can begin to support new legislation. I believe that the government should allow a natural transition to happen, which history shows can happen, as it did with the transition from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles. However, this would mean that the transition extends past the year 2050. I believe this longer transition must take place. Stephen Carlisle, president and managing director of General Motors Canada, stated that, quote, "The shift from horses to cars was actually a 50-year period of change and transformation, complete with large safety and environmental and economic challenges, not unlike today," end quote. Transitioning means developing new infrastructure. Infrastructure, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is the underlying foundation or basic framework as of a system or organization. Infrastructure includes physical buildings like charging stations and factories, obtaining materials needed for substances like lithium-ion car batteries and improved power grids, and carbon offset programs. There's a great need to develop clean ways to obtain necessary materials. Mining for necessary resources both makes America's biopollution worse and spreads it to other areas around the globe. A study done saw that in 2019 saw that more than 50 million gallons of contaminated wastewater from U.S. mines flowed into local water sources every day. There are ways to make mining cleaner, but right now few to none are being put into effect. These include, but are not limited to, using waste rocks in on-site construction, backfilling empty spaces, and reconstructing unused mines in order to prevent erosion, and purifying mine water so that it can be reused as drinking water and for dust suppression. So what do we even need these minerals for? An example is electric car batteries. Right now there are two types, liquid and solid state. Solid state batteries are safer than liquid state, but they are much heavier, they don't last long, and they cost far more to make. Liquid state batteries, like lithium-ion car batteries, are more dangerous and flammable, especially in a wreck, and require more safety precautions. As of now, only liquid state batteries are used because there is no way to combat the rate at which the solid state battery depletes and to compensate for its weight. With more electric vehicles comes a higher demand for electricity, and our power grid cannot support more electricity usage, which is an inevitable ramification of carbon neutrality. And there are not enough charging stations to support the continued production of electric vehicles. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, was forced to ask his citizens to stop charging their electric vehicles as their power grid was experiencing failures. In order to revolutionize power grids around the country, the American government and private contractors will need lots of money. So what will all these new things cost? Who pays for it? How can we cleanly obtain what we need to make the electric cars, revamp the power grid, and make an EV charging network? To support new batteries, wind power fields, and solar power fields being developed, America needs to create the infrastructure, but that takes decades and large sums of money. A team of energy researchers at Princeton University found that the total bill could require tens of trillions in investments. Though estimates like these are inherently speculative, the bill would range from $7.8 trillion to $13.9 trillion over the next 30 years. Additionally, electric vehicles are expensive. An electric vehicle, as of now, costs on average around $61,000, compared to the average of $40,000 for a new gasoline car. At the end of 2022, American citizens between the ages of 25 and 34 made around $50,000 on average, while citizens between the ages of 35 and 44 made $61,000 on average. By expanding the time frame of the transition, less money will be required at once. A longer time frame minimizes the burden on the country as a whole and still achieves the same goal. It allows people time to both mentally and physically transition, and by doing this, Americans can become comfortable and there will be more support for the transition to carbon neutrality altogether. In conclusion, achieving carbon neutrality in the United States by 2050 is not realistic due to the stress it puts on society through economic change, financial burden, and the short time frame to achieve the end goal. American citizens rely on fossil fuels in their economy for over half of their energy supply and for necessary items in their everyday lives. Additionally, the cost to transition into carbon neutrality by 2050 is immense. The government should instead extend the time frame to help soften the financial blow. Finally, the average American cannot currently afford most of the proposed methods of reducing carbon emissions, especially electric vehicles. Carbon neutrality is achievable in America, but missing Christmas with your family is not the right path. Thank you.
Are there any faculty questions?
Ms. Oliver.
Thanks for your presentation, Josh. I'm curious, some countries have started moving towards high-speed rail for transportation. Did you research anything into that when searching for a solution?
Thank you for your question. I didn't do specific research into high-speed rail and stuff like that, but I do know that it still requires electricity. It is a good form of transportation, but right now America has yet to start introducing it, and it could be a great way of, using a form of mass transportation to still get people where they need to be quickly. So I think it could definitely be part of a solution in the future.
Thanks.
Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Josh. If you open a newspaper or read on the topics that you discussed today, you'll find claims like the following. That Earth loses hundreds of tons of atmosphere to space every day due to CO2 emissions. I'm curious if you can speak to the fears behind those claims. Are they true, and what is maybe the science behind what's going on there?
Thank you for your question. So that is correct. The the Earth is being affected by these emissions. However, I did find, I found a study that showed that even if we were to stop emitting carbon pollution today, it would take almost a century, and for us to even be able to detect the smallest reduction of the ozone layer being reduced or whatnot, and it takes millions of years for that stuff to fall back to the earth and in the form of rock and stuff like that. So the study stated that essentially, as far as current humanity is concerned, it's essentially up there forever. And in a few millennia, it will come down. But we won't be around to see it, and our descendants' descendants won't even be around to see it. So while we should, carbon neutrality is something we should be pursuing. the effect that it has already had will take millions of years to disappear, and that's if we stopped producing carbon emissions today.
And a quick follow-up. I've heard that CO2 causes a heating effect when it's released. I'm curious why that might happen or what you may know about that.
The heating effect is due to its like kind of eating away at the ozone layer, which kind of reduces the Earth's natural ability to mitigate the effect the sun has. So, yeah, that's the effect CO2 has.
Thank you.
Mr. Palin.
Thank you, Joshua, for your very relevant presentation. I just wanted to follow up from your answer to Mr. Hansen. If it's going to take millions of years for the Earth's atmosphere to probably bounce back into more of a safe, neutral position, why is climate change worth fighting?
Thank you for your question. So I'll answer the second part first. Climate change is worth fighting because God has given man a call to preserve creation. It is stated clearly in Genesis, man must preserve his creation. In order to do that, we should be trying to reduce the amount of emissions we're putting into our atmosphere. So even if it will take millions of years for the difference to be noticeable, and that's just like, everything falling back to the earth. Within the next, again, around a century, we could see the amount, or the temperature increase start to reduce. So, but it has to do with man's call to preserve creation and the fact that God has given us a duty to cultivate the earth.
Okay, and as a follow-up question, if 2050 is not an effective year or a healthy year to shoot for this neutrality, is there a proposed year that we should aim for?
I personally don't have one. I believe the transition should just be a natural one, which means it just kind of happens when it happens. Which, it sounds very not concrete, and people like a concrete plan, but the transition from horses to cars wasn't one of saying, okay, we're going to be done with this transition X date. It just kind of happened naturally. And, through pushing for all these new things, it will happen, but putting a date on it, which is in less than 30 years, and just by pushing all of these financial burdens onto people, it just creates a lot of unneeded and stress. So to answer your question simply, I don't have a concrete date. I believe that the transition should be natural and just happen as society allows it.
Thank you.
Mr. Richard.
Thanks, Josh. Are there any ways to make fossil fuels cleaner that are cost effective?
So you're asking like mining them and things like that? Or to,
I don't believe we mine fossil fuels.
well, drilling, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
So like more cost effective ways to drill?
No, the fossil fuels themselves, like hydrogen, what have you, being cleaner burning, so it does affect CO2 emissions.
Okay, thank you. So the best way to kind of clean these things up is by cleaning up the ways we refine them. So by using them in themselves, they're going to produce carbon emissions by their very nature. But what we can do as a society to help mitigate that, and again, so carbon neutrality is offsetting the emissions of your business or economy. So we can offset what we do burn by cleanly refining it. And whenever we drill, finding ways to cleanly drill, which right now we haven't found anything useful in that sense to cleanly drill for oil or mine minerals. But by refining by cleaning up the refinement process, we can kind of offset the effect that burning has.
All right, thank you.
Ms. Velosa.
Thank you for that presentation, Josh. You spoke to your research as far as the drilling and the mess that the drilling made in order to produce the materials needed for the batteries for the EV cars. In your research, did you find anything correlating it to the cleanup costs typically for drilling mistakes or drilling spills and whatnot that happen quite often?
Thank you for your question. So, I focused a lot in my research on mining for minerals as opposed to drilling for oil. But drilling for oil by its nature, the cost is very high. That's why right now we're not doing a lot of it. And we're also trying to just avoid drilling accidents, spills, and stuff, and the like you said, because that cost is so high. But I don't have any exact numbers for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mr. Frugier.
Thank you, Josh. Climate, global warming, deep in my heart as a debater. At one point you mentioned the Paris Agreement. You also referenced that there are some countries that have achieved carbon neutral status. I'm curious as to an example of a country that was carbon neutral. That would be the first.
Thank you for your question. So I mentioned in my presentation, like you said, that 8 small countries have claimed to have achieved carbon neutrality. However, in examining the way their economy works and they conduct their business, by the definition that I gave, they have not actually achieved carbon neutrality. That's just the status that they have, or that I guess the Paris Agreement would give them. So again, carbon neutrality being you offset the emissions of your business and national economy. These countries, so example is Madagascar, has achieved carbon neutrality, but they outsource a lot of their production to other countries. So they're still importing goods that are still made, emissions are produced as a result. So that would be an example of one, but none of these countries have achieved a true carbon neutrality in terms of the way they conduct their business with manufacturing.
A follow-up would be, what has United States pollution, if you will, compared to countries like China or Russia? In your research, did you find any comparisons between the two countries? And is there anything that a major polluter like China is doing in this direction of carbon neutrality?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I did do some research into that. In fact, I talk about how in order for the United States to achieve carbon neutrality, we have to work with all companies in China, all of those companies that are producing goods for us and exporting them to us, in order to mitigate their pollution. So China itself has set a deadline for 2060, but at the rate they're currently going, based off the research I've done, they won't be able to hit this deadline because so much manufacturing is done in China and it's very pollutive. And so they're not really on track to meet their deadline by any means. And again, there is no other country that's pledged carbon neutrality that is putting policy into effect like the United States, or even drafting it. Something they could do would be or something I guess the world could do, the United States in relation to other countries it sources manufacturing to, would be to kind of balance out where a product gets made. Instead of just having everything made in one place, maybe bring some of it back to America, have some more American-made goods, and just kind of enable small countries to produce goods and stuff. So, and at the same time, you're kind of promoting the global economy, while also enabling people or countries to help mitigate their carbon output.
Thank you.
Any senior questions?
Mary Kate.
Okay, you keep using the word like clean, and you keep talking about like clean methods, but I know a lot of times that's kind of used as like a buzzword or a marketing strategy. So I was just wondering what the clean methods you're talking about actually look like, or if you have like a definition.
So clean in the way I'm using it basically means not damaging the environment, essentially. So a lot of the things that are like, okay, and clean energy would be something that is not actively emitting CO2 emissions. So that would be kind of a baseline definition for it. So in my paper, I talk about how right now we don't have any clean ways to produce materials, and we're not offsetting the pollution from mining and things like that. So whenever we speak about clean energy, clean ways to do things, I'm referring to things that don't damage the environment, but what I'm arguing is that we need to find clean ways to do these, to mine, to produce products and refine fossil fuels if we're going to achieve carbon neutrality. So that is how I'm using the term clean.
Thanks.
Patrick.
Thanks, Josh. Okay, so I think it's true that there's always going to be some carbon emissions. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So then, if there's always going to be some carbon emissions, you keep saying we have to offset. Like, what are practical ways that we offset carbon emissions to achieve this neutral net zero status?
Thank you. So one great example that David gave in his capstone is the plan to plant X number of trees by 2030. That's something the government's doing to try and offset our carbon impact. Something we can do just as citizens, something as simple as carpooling is a great way to do it, even though it sounds almost inconvenient at times. If it's something you really think about and something that as a country we really want to achieve, again, something just as simple as using mass transportation. Ms. Ardo mentioned the rail system. Things like that would be great ways to offset our carbon emissions.
Thank you.
Garrett, sorry.
Thanks, Josh. So because mining like lithium for these carbohydrates is so damaging to the environment itself, do you think that we should instead pursue something cleaner, like say nuclear power?
Thank you for your question. So that is something that's in the works, but right now we haven't been able to use nuclear power in a controlled setting. I think that something like nuclear power is absolutely what our future will look like. So yeah, I guess if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Abigail.
What would you say about, since you're transitioning from like gas and oil vehicles to more electric vehicles, what would you say about the employment of like oil rig workers, since they would have less jobs?
Yeah, thank you. So that is one of the issues with this transition, is trying to create new jobs, which it can be done, as there's new factories being made to produce batteries and such. But you're absolutely right. That is one of the problems that I talk about in my paper, is if you're going to take jobs away from people who are certified to do this thing, you have to enable them to have, to get certified in something else, in order to help them, so their quality of life isn't diminished, basically.
Thank you, Josh.